At 3 in the morning, I counted the shipping containers 3 times, and every single time I got a different number. My name is Mike Johnson. I am 30 years old and unmarried. I searched for many job opportunities and worked at many jobs, but I had no luck with any of them. For reasons related to the salary, sometimes because of coworkers, and other times because of the manager. I stayed in this situation for 2 years, and after those 2 years I found a job as a night security guard at a massive container yard near a port in the state of Georgia. The salary was tempting, and the coworkers, supervisors, and manager were all extremely kind and friendly. The place wasn't a seaport per se, but rather a private storage yard where containers were left temporarily before being moved to shipping companies or warehouses. The yard was surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, and there were 2 large gates that could only be opened using an electronic keycard. The nature of my work wasn't hard at all, from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning. My task was to log the entry and exit of trucks, perform hourly patrol rounds, and ensure that no one was inside the yard after business operations ended at night. After midnight, the place turned into a vast expanse of container metal and darkness, and hundreds of containers were stacked on top of each other in long rows, with narrow aisles between them where flashlight beams reached only intermittently. I had been working there for 10 months, so I knew the layout of the yard almost as well as I knew my own house. I knew the number of rows, the locations of containers with unique numbers, and even the containers that remained in their spots for weeks due to paperwork issues. The system used in the warehouse was extremely precise. Every container that entered or exited had its number recorded in the database, and the gate cameras took pictures of the truck, its license plate, and the container number at the exact same second. So it wasn't normal for the container count to change without a logged entry or exit operation. That night, no truck entered after 10 in the evening. I was sure of it. Shortly before the start of my 3rd patrol round, I sat in the guard shack and took a look at the system screen. The total number of containers in the yard was 436. I logged the number in the patrol logbook and then went out. The patrol took about 40 minutes. As usual, everything was normal, and I didn't notice anything in the yard or with the containers. The gates were locked, and there were no cars, no workers, nor any unusual movement. The surprise that shocked me was when I returned to the guard shack and looked at the system screen again. I found the container count to be 437. I stared at the number for several seconds, thinking it was a system glitch. I refreshed the page and the number didn't change. 437 containers. How did the container count increase when I hadn't logged the entry of any additional trucks? I reviewed the entry and exit log and found no new entry operations. I called the shift supervisor to tell him what happened, but he didn't answer. I decided to go out and count the containers in the last rows myself. I grabbed my flashlight and started the round. After about 10 minutes, I reached the row number 18. And there I noticed something I had never seen before. There was a gray container at the end of the row that had no clear shipping number on it, just an old white sticker torn right down the middle. I approached it and tried to read the small metal number on the door. It was MSCU 481927. I wrote the number down in the logbook and then looked at my watch. It was 2:15 in the morning. I returned to the guard shack and entered the number into the system. A message popped up saying, "Container not found in database." I thought it was a recently arrived container that hadn't been added yet, but that didn't make sense because any container entering the yard goes through the main gate where it gets photographed and registered before the truck is allowed in. I started reviewing the camera footage, and from 10 in the evening onward, no vehicle had entered since that time. I rewound the footage to 8, 6, and 5 o'clock, but found nothing. Finally, at 4 o'clock, I saw the container. It was in the yard 2 hours before the start of my shift. But it wasn't in row 18, it was in row 11. I felt a cold chill and jumped to the midnight footage. At 12:43, one of the cameras cut out for 17 seconds due to a signal glitch, and when the picture came back, the container was in row 18. No truck had entered, no person appeared, and the camera hadn't moved. The container had simply vanished from its first spot and appeared in another. I sat in front of the screen, trying to think of any logical explanation, but found none. Then I noticed something worse. In the camera recording at 1:06 a.m., the door of that very container appeared open. The weird thing to me wasn't the open container door I saw in the camera footage. The weird thing was that I had clearly seen from inside the guard shack that the door was closed when I walked past it just minutes ago. I replayed the clip 3 times, then noticed something that made my hands freeze over the control panel. Before the door opened, there was no one in front of the container. After it opened, the shadow of a person standing in the dark appeared inside, and then the door slowly shut from the inside. I didn't sleep that night and stayed in front of the surveillance monitors, replaying the exact same recording dozens of times. I was trying to convince myself that the camera angle or video compression made me see something that wasn't there, but the shadow was clear. It was inside the container before the door closed, and there was no way anyone could have entered it from the outside. I called the supervisor again, and this time he answered after several rings. I told him what happened, and at first he laughed, saying I probably misread the container number. I sent him a screenshot, and his tone changed slightly, asking me not to go near it until he arrived in the morning. I asked him why, but he didn't give me a clear answer. He just said, "Don't open any container, no matter what you find in the logs." That last sentence was more disturbing than everything I had seen. Before the call ended, I asked him if he knew the container with the number MSCU 81927. He went silent for 10 seconds, then said, "Are you sure about the number?" I said yes. He replied in a low voice, "That number doesn't exist in our system." I told him I entered it myself, so he said, "I'm not talking about the system. I mean, that number isn't even part of the container numbers we own." Then he hung up. At 2 a.m, I started hearing knocking sounds coming from the yard. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more knocks. The sound of the knocking came from a spot near the middle rows. I went out to the yard to investigate, but I didn't go far. I stood beside the guardhouse, shined my flashlight toward the containers, and saw nothing. The air was cold, and a light fog was starting to gather between the rows. Then I heard the knocking again, and this time it was coming from the gray container, and it was clearer. It felt like someone was using their hand from inside the gray container. I took several steps forward, then stopped. I was about 10 meters away from the door when I heard a long, metal scraping sound, as if someone was dragging something heavy inside the container. I picked up my walkie-talkie and asked the supervisor to call the police. I got no response from the supervisor. I looked at the walkie-talkie and the signal was there. I went back into the guard shack and locked the door. A few minutes later, I received a message on the surveillance system that read, "Container MSCU 481927 opened." I sat in front of the screen to watch the camera and saw the container door slowly start to move. No one came out of the container, and the door stayed open for about 10 seconds before closing again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the previous recording. I noticed footprints on the ground in front of the container. The footprints started from inside it and headed toward the aisle, then abruptly stopped after about 6 meters. I couldn't find anyone in the frame. I replayed the footage from another camera and found the same thing. Footprints appearing in front of the container, but no one appearing to make them. At that moment, I decided to call the police myself. I told them there was a possibility someone was inside one of the containers and that I needed a patrol to check out the site. I didn't tell them about the shadow or the container that appeared without a truck because I knew how that would sound if I tried to explain it over the phone. While I was waiting for the police to arrive, I went back to the inventory system. This time I started reviewing old logs, searching for the container number. Unfortunately, I didn't find it, but I found something else. There was a group of containers that would appear in the system under different numbers, then disappear hours or days later, without an exit log recorded. At first, I thought they were administrative errors, but when I compared the dates, I discovered a strange pattern. All the containers appeared for the first time around the exact same hour after midnight, and all of them were present in the yard before disappearing from the system. Then I noticed that some of their numbers were linked to old reports about containers lost during transit, some of which had been logged years ago. I closed the file immediately, and before I could step away from the screen, a new message popped up. Container MSCU 481927 opened. I looked at the camera and found the door was closed. Then I heard the sound of metal scraping against the floor behind me. I turned around slowly and saw no people, but I found the guard shack door wide open, even though I was absolutely sure I'd locked it with the key. I didn't move from my spot when I saw the guard shack door open, and I won't deny how terrified I was. I just stared at the door while trying to remember the last time I walked into the room. I was sure I had locked it with the key before leaving for my patrol, but I no longer trusted my memory after everything that had happened. I grabbed my flashlight and walkie-talkie, then slowly stepped forward, finding no one inside. Everything was in its place, except for the patrol logbook, which was open to the page where I had recorded the container count at the beginning of the night. And underneath the number 436, a new line was written in black pen, and it wasn't my handwriting. It was a short sentence that read, "Don't count the containers. Count the doors." I kept staring at the sentence until I felt my stomach knot up. At first, I thought one of the workers had written it to scare me, but then I remembered that I had been alone in the yard ever since truck traffic ended. I called the police again and told them I thought someone was trespassing in the warehouse. This time, the dispatcher said he would send a patrol right away, but the closest unit was more than 20 minutes out. I didn't wait for the police to arrive. I grabbed the taser in the guard shack and started reviewing the yard cameras one by one. I was looking for anyone who might have entered after midnight. A few minutes later, I discovered something I didn't understand at first. Every time one of the containers appeared in a different row, another camera would stop recording for a few seconds. The wastage wasn't random. It always happened in an area far from the guard shack, almost as if someone knew the exact blind spots the cameras didn't cover. Then I reviewed the yard map hanging on the wall. Between the old rows, there was a narrow maintenance area that was only used when cranes needed repairs. The area was surrounded by tall containers and couldn't be seen from the gate. I remembered something important. Over the last 2 months, 3 containers had shown up in the logs and then vanished, without a formal exit log. Back then, I thought it was an administrative error, but now I started considering another possibility. I left the guard shack and headed toward the maintenance area because I needed to know the truth before the police arrived. As I got closer, I began to hear a faint human voice, as if someone was talking from behind a thick metal wall. I stopped between 2 rows of containers and raised my flashlight to see, but saw no one. Then the voice came again. I couldn't understand the words, but I realized it was coming from inside one of the containers. I slowly approached until I reached an old blue container whose door was secured with an external padlock. I pressed my ear against the metal and heard rapid breathing from inside. I immediately backed away and called the police, telling them I thought someone was trapped inside a container. This time the officer instructed me not to open it, no matter what. But before he could finish talking, I heard a loud noise behind me. I turned around and found the gray container I had seen at the beginning of the night wide open. And even stranger, the blue container I was standing next to began to shake from the inside. Then came violent knocking sounds, and I started hearing someone screaming, saying, "Open the door!" I ran toward the lock, but stopped right before touching it. Something wasn't right. The voice wasn't just coming from inside the container. There was another, much fainter voice coming from the gray container behind me. The voice said, "Don't open it!" I froze, then heard the man inside the blue container scream, "He knows we're here!" A police car arrived less than 2 minutes later, and when the officers entered the yard, they found me standing between the two containers. They opened the blue container, and the shock was even greater than I expected. Inside, they found 2 men suffering from dehydration, one unconscious and the other barely able to speak. They told us later that the men were victims of a robbery and human trafficking operation, and that someone was using some of the abandoned containers to hide people and goods without the warehouse management's knowledge. As for the changing container counts, it was because some of the involved workers were using yard equipment during the night to move containers between areas not covered by cameras. But one question remained unanswered. Who was inside the gray container? The officers opened it and found it completely empty. No people, no equipment, not even recent tracks on the ground. But they found a small notebook inside, and when one of the officers opened it, he found the names of dozens of people, with a date next to each name.